I am now supposed to hand it over to, I haven't done this before. I'm going to hand it over to our last panel of the day, and that is going to be harnessing infrastructure concerns around electric vehicles. Our moderator is Daniel. He's from Dominion Energy, and he's got Jonathan and Ted as panelists. So Daniel, I'm not going to steal your thunder. I'm going to let you tell about their expertise and what we can expect in the next 45 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great panel. I know, Ted, you can hear me good? Perfect. Okay. Jonathan, I know he's going to be on phone by joining us by phone. So yeah, just to integrate into the to our panel, and then think about the last two panels that have spoken and provided some excellent information. The the infrastructure concerns around EV, I would describe it as a subset of maybe the discussion that took place in the prior panel or the prior two panels. So to set the stage, when you think of energy infrastructure, and then you think of it as supply, and then you think of it as delivery, and then you think of it as load that is being served, that introduction of a new load or an emerging load is just one more significant input into the business model. And I think the expectations around what the utility will be required to do, as well as what service providers will be required to do, is going to be significant if transportation is going to be integrated as deeply as we believe it will be into the energy infrastructure ecosystem. So pleased to have Ted and Jonathan with me today. I'd like them to introduce themselves, and then we'll hit a series of questions. Ted, let you go first.
Sure. Thanks, Danny. Great to be here. Great to be a part of this panel. So my name is Ted Walker. I'm a partner at Guidehouse. Guidehouse is a consulting firm, and one of our focus areas is in the energy and sustainability area. So I lead the South market for that practice, and we work with a number of players across the ecosystem. But the main driver of that is around the intersection of energy and sustainability, and obviously electric vehicles are a big part of that. Electrification of transportation are a big part of that future there. So predominantly, some of our bigger clients are companies like Dominion Energy, Duke Energy, et cetera. And I've personally been involved in the electric vehicle industry for really the last 15 years. I was an early adopter of one of the EVs, and just now on my third EV right now. So something I like to play around with on the side.
Nice, Ted. Thank you. Jonathan?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jonathan Anschutz. I am the manager of the Commonwealth Response Coordination Center at the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency in Harrisburg. Basically, my role is primarily response-oriented in coordinating resources out to disasters. And one of the things that we have been looking at is how are EVs and the disaster space, when they intersect each other, what considerations do we need to look at? Specifically, one of the things that I've been looking at recently is when we have long-duration road closures, or if we need to evacuate or redirect large slugs of traffic, how do we start to anticipate how that can happen given the build out or lack thereof of the EV infrastructure? So that's what I'm going to be speaking to primarily today.
Excellent. So I'll start off with a question, and I'll also provide some input. I'm very familiar with, for instance, the South Carolina jurisdiction. Ted is kind of provides maybe more of a broader perspective across really the country. But what role, Ted, would policy play at the local, the state, and the federal level I'm watching it play out now in South Carolina. And how does that play in terms of infrastructure for EV readiness in the charging space?
Yeah, I could take a shot up and love Danny, for you to add on thoughts as well. But really, I mean, the policy angle of this, and we could talk more about this later, but policy for electrification to move towards scale, or a scale move towards electrification of the transportation sector, I mean, requires very complex, requires a number of interrelated components. Obviously, vehicle availability, customer awareness, infrastructure availability, and services around that. So policy plays a big role across those, specifically within infrastructure. Looking at local policy, one of the biggest, future proofing or roles that the local policy can have is really future proofing. And you think about building codes, and we see a lot of jurisdictions doing this, moving to building codes that require EV ready charging in dwellings and building codes for workplaces, et cetera there. So really greasing the skids for electrification that's going to come over the next 5-10 years, and making sure that decisions made today are future proofed. At the state level, I think with some of the recent federal funding in this space that is going to be doled out by the states, I think the states have a bigger role. Obviously, depending on the state, there's tax incentives for not only vehicles but also infrastructure in some states. But the program, the NEVI program funding, which is specifically funding infrastructure deployments, and having the state level allocation of those programs, obviously very key to make sure that how it's distributed and looking at equitable distribution for that is key. Also at the state level, a couple other things, again, broader than just infrastructure. One is, whether the state is a part of the ZEV, movement, the zero emission vehicle movement. And that will really put align the ecosystem around moving towards zero emission vehicles, and with both a carrot and stick type approach. Finally, at the state level, I think the last piece of this is at the Public Utility Commission level is working with those utilities like Dominion Energy and others to provide oversight on the charging infrastructure rollout, the grid readiness, the utility programs that are an important part of the infrastructure equation. Danny, I mean, I know you have firsthand knowledge. Anything to add there?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ted. I think what I'm seeing play out, at least in a couple of jurisdictions, is I'm really seeing this uncertainty about how the model develops with respect to the infrastructure. I think people recognize the utilities got to deliver the energy, so it's usually the distribution investment that's got to, not only does it have to deliver, but it's got to be highly reliable now, maybe more reliable than it's ever been. And so kind of this, what I would describe as this planning exercise for the next iteration of electrification is critical. What I think is the best practice, or I believe I'm seeing play out as best practice, is that the stakeholders are really at the state level are going to have to get deeply engaged. It can't be siloed infrastructure planning. And I think, if you're an EV charger, or you're, the utility, or you're an O&M provider, everybody needs to be at the table, creating good and effective policy. And I think the fact that Jonathan's on this panel, and is representing emergency response, if we're making this transition into an electrified transportation system, it's not only got to work, you got to have policy that not only works during, the 99.9% of the time where it's the everyday, everything works fine. It's the 0.1% of the time that things aren't exactly working the way people expected them to work. Somebody's got a plan for that. And I think that's the thing that I think I'm I think that's best practice in what I would describe as the policy space. The implementation of that is probably much more difficult, only because I think people come to the stakeholder process with very certain ideas about their business model and what they're trying to accomplish. And you've got to park some of that in the end of the day if you're going to get best practice. So I'd like to hear from Jonathan in terms of maybe, are you seeing any of that stakeholder process in your jurisdiction, or is it still, maybe separate and distinct planning process, maybe that hasn't merged together?
I think it's probably the latter, Danny. Being in the emergency management sphere and then the specific segment of response within emergency management, it's not something that I'm personally involved with at this point. I do know there are segments of Commonwealth government that are looking at that, but I can't really speak to those since they haven't intersected with my portion yet.
Yeah, no, I think that's not, I think that's actually maybe more of the norm right now, because, Ted, you're on your third EV. I'm on my first. So I'm a newbie in this space, but I'm learning quite a number of things about, for instance, when I went to Charlotte from Charleston last week, I couldn't take my EV. And it wasn't because I had range anxiety. It was because there just isn't infrastructure that would accommodate the schedule I needed to make for a trip and then an overnight and then get back and where I needed to be. And I think that's the stuff that's just the everyday stuff that's got to be solved. So that's the one thing that I encourage, is that the Jonathans of the world need to be in the process too. It's not just those that want to just deploy capital, but I think it's kind of beyond that. So I'll boot to the next question, which is actually around, those who end up, whether they're taxpayers and customers, but what are the customer expectations when it comes to future transportation ecosystem? And Ted, you're a driver, so you probably can answer it from a couple of perspectives, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. And then I've already given mine. I'm so far, I'm disappointed, right? I can drive around. I can drive 1,000 miles here locally, but I want to get out with it, right?
Right. No, that's a great question. Customer expectations, a lot of cases, it's very early adopter. It's very early in the cycle. So most people, I still have people ask me, well, how do you drive the EV? Well, okay. How do you charge the EV? There's things like that. So it's very few people, we put it as kind of the cheeks and seats. Have you actually driven enough vehicle? Have you seen that? And until you do that, it's very demystifying, and there's a lot of unknowns. So I think when you think about the customer expectations, it kind of depends where they are, but I think most are very early in the cycle. I mentioned one of the 4 key drivers of the ecosystem will be customer awareness. So just that customer awareness of what are the options out there, but also, really moving that, would my next vehicle purchase, would an EV make sense to me? And, I've done it, it's an informal, as I mentioned, I work with a lot of utilities, and one of my favorite things probably 5 years ago, whenever I met with the utility executive team, I would just ask, who in this room has actually driven an electric vehicle? You're looking at, VPs or whatever, directors across the utility. And in most cases 5 years ago, only a handful of people, a vast minority of the room had actually sat driven one. And in one case, I actually brought, I asked one of the local dealers of an EV manufacturer to bring some vehicles out for some test drives. And it's even talking to the people before they got in the car and after they got out, most of them said, I don't know. I don't think an EV makes sense for me. And then afterwards they're like, wow, I can actually see my next purchase being an EV. So that's on the consumer side. Same thing for the fleet side. That you think about the fleet owners, the commercial vehicles or municipal fleets, et cetera. The fleet managers really have that same reality. So I think customer awareness is really key, but that's part of it. The rest of it is really, you understand an internal combustion vehicle, how to drive it. The driving's really not that different, but you know how to fuel it, you know where to go get maintenance, to deal with, how to deal with, certain other intricacies of it. So, vehicle availability, making it easy. You still have some cases where, auto dealerships, for makes of vehicles that, have both EVs and internal combustions, the actual sales associates, it takes longer to sell an EV. So if they want to do a quick sell, they may try to talk you out of an EV type thing. So you have that really to grease the skids there. But the other piece is, how do you charge it? So making it easy. Do you charging at home, charging at work, charging while you're out, destination corridor charges. You mentioned, Danny. If I need to go between, if I have to go between, Atlanta and Charlotte, how do I charge it, et cetera. And then finally, maintenance, that maintenance piece, and how do I, can I just take it to the dealership like I do my car, or take it to Bob's service station down the road, or do I need to think about something else? So I think from a consumer perspective, it's really solving all those and making it easy for them to, to make that decision. That's how the scale play is going to happen here. Right now we're still kind of in the, I'd call it still the early adopter phase.
I'm going to give you some affirmation. So since I've learned more in a month about driving an EV than I ever would have thought you could learn. I mean, just all those experiences. And I will say this, you're right. The experience around acquisition. There wasn't much a sales guy could help me with. So that's not there either. So I mean, I think it's going to take some time. So I mean, that's one thing that might be, in the infrastructure space, that might be somewhat of an advantage, because it doesn't. You're not immediately. We're talking a lot about passenger vehicles here, and maybe not the next iteration of charging, which becomes even more critical. So, absolutely. Jonathan, I'll just ask you, is there any in the emergency planning process? I mean, I would think that still customers or end users are, they're in a force majeure event. You're right. There are going to be some things probably that you're going to want to think or incorporate ultimately into your planning process.
Oh yeah, absolutely, for sure. One of the things that we would want to look at, if you look at the types of threats and hazards that we have specifically here in Pennsylvania, one of our biggest threats is flooding. It could be riverine flooding, could be flash flooding, just based on the terrain, the urban infrastructure that we have with poor drainage infrastructure. So you can get a quick event with ponding of roadways, flash flooding. Obviously, if you have flash flooding, there's issues with debris there. And I think some of the concerns are after the event, if you're going in and you're doing debris clearance, and as the EV space expands, how many EVs were now part of that debris field? And then what are the impacts of the debris and the flooding on those EVs, specifically when we look at runaways on the charging systems and the threat for fire afterwards. One thing that we've been cautiously watching is the hurricane states. And how they deal with storm surge flooding and what's happening with electric vehicles after they're going through and they're either clearing out the debris fields and taking those electric vehicles to scrap facilities or junkyards, or just taking them to debris collection facilities for eventual movement onwards later. And how is the saltwater incursion affecting those batteries? We fortunately don't have that saltwater problem here, but we do have the freshwater problem. And if you get some debris whacking the battery on that vehicle, causes a water incursion, are you going to have a threat for fire either during the event or, it could be days, weeks, or even months later after the event because of how that battery pack's been compromised. So that's just something that we would need to look at and be more aware of and cautious, especially with emergency management. We've got multiple phases. One phase is response, but then the other phase is that recovery period where you're going in and you're doing those damage assessments. So you need to be aware of looking at those from a hazard standpoint.
Yeah, just a couple of comments that feed into that. I think, I live in a coastal region, and Charleston's prone to sunny day flooding on certain tide situations. So it's it makes me think about even on a normal day. But then when you get a force majeure event, yeah, that could be impactful. And then, full disclosure, I worked Hurricane Floyd in 1999, and South Carolina couldn't evacuate internal combustion engines that day during Hurricane Floyd. So we're throwing an additional element of complexity, I guess, into a response to a force majeure event. So
yeah, absolutely, Danny. One of the things we look at in terms of evacuations, and we haven't really gone very far down this road, but we're starting to consider it with our evacuation planning, is are the evacuation routes planned for EVs? Most likely not. They're most likely going to be planned for your standard passenger vehicle, maybe buses, something along those lines. So when you look at like our nuclear power plants that we have here in Pennsylvania, looking at the evacuation routes associated with those, because those are the ones that have the pre-designated routes in Pennsylvania, we need to start thinking about that. Yeah, how far can the EV go if it doesn't have a full charge before it needs to have a charging area? What are the risks to the public if they start to deviate off of those evacuation routes because they're trying to find a charging space? That's going to protract the evacuation process. So these are all things that planners should be thinking of, is really taking a deep dive look at those pre-planned routes. And as you said, even in South Carolina, in that contraflow, it's going to take a certain amount of time to get from point A to point B. But if you don't have sufficient charging stations along I-26 or whatever it may be coming up out of the coastal areas, how are EVs going to deviate off of that route? And then how long is it going to take for evacuees to get to a point of refuge? And that's all something planners everywhere should be thinking of, whether or not they're in the tropical coastal areas that are prone to hurricanes. You're in a state like here that's prone to flooding or nuclear power plant issues, or you're out in the West and you're prone to wildfires and you may have to pack up and go in a hurry. So all things to consider.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that I guess one of the cornerstones of the Dominion transportation roadmap is universal access. And you think of that as just universal access to charging as, a really narrow, opportunity around, places that aren't on major interstates or major thoroughfares. But the reality is it's that investment is like that access investment is likely to be something that integrates into your emergency plan. Those evacuation routes in the end of the day, I've done the hurricane exercise 15 times in my lifetime. And, as a utility employee, and I've known plenty of folks who have left and decided they would come back later, but you don't follow that natural corridor, which is the likely place where the original, the charging corridors, that's fine. You get those electrified, you have that access. But other places where they're not necessarily the major thoroughfare routes, but they're places where you deviate off of, there's got to be some kind of access. That's got to be incorporated. I don't really see any way to do that or any way to attract capital to those types of investments unless it's the actual utility likely doing it, or there's some collaborative effort. To me, it's like the equivalency of, I think where some jurisdictions got with broadband. If you don't have a way to focus the investment or have a path to it, they just don't get it. And maybe this is the convergence of that, possibly. So, Ted, let me ask you a question. What's the best model, or at least from what you've seen in maybe your consulting work around this space? What's the best model for critical grid and charging infrastructure so that we can get more adoption, which is, an increasingly clean transportation strategy, but also ensuring that we get the reliability and the resiliency? Is there a best model out there that we should be looking at?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts here. I mean, you think, whether you're talking about, individual, households or fleet owners, and whether you're talking about, light duty vehicles or medium duty vehicles, and to some extent heavy duty vehicles, really having, there's not one right approach for the when and where for charging. And I think the model we've seen kind of take hold is, as we climb the S curve in electrification, it's the charge everywhere model. So, you can't rely on home or like overnight charging for fleets only. You can't rely on workplace or like, during the day charging, kind of on the run charging for fleets, or even corridor charging. None of those are going to work in isolation. So it's got to be an everywhere model. And, as we continue to get more EVs on the road, the scale play is going to get there. But I mean, from a grid and charging infrastructure, that helps spread the load out. When you think about when you're charging and where you're charging, that will not having to say, well, we're always going to charge here and we're going to have to charge, this class of vehicle all at the same time. The concept of smart charging, and we'll probably get more into that later, but smart charging is really, think of that as being able to control charging, control the rate and the time of charging, based on the supply and demand characteristics on the rest of the grid. So, very little charging is what you call necessity charging. Now if Danny's, driving between, Charleston and Charlotte, he has to stop and has to make that meeting. That's necessity charging. But, the vast majority of charging is more convenience charging versus that necessity charging. So you can interrupt it, or slow it down with very little impact on, the vehicle owner operators, the rest of the vehicle usage that day. So smart charging, it requires, that to be working throughout the, integrated deeply into the grid, but also integrated into, to the charging infrastructure and even the vehicle. So that is a very complex. Right now, there's, the smart level of smart charging is kind of still pretty analog versus getting much more digital and down to the minute by minute level and down to the, kilowatt by kilowatt level, if you will. So, from a utility perspective, having that, enabled by advanced DMS, distribution management system across the grid, that's actually in a much more, minute fashion, managing the supply and demand, across the system, but across every single, feeder circuit, if you will. You might have heard a lot about vehicle to grid, and this is where, the maybe where we're going to head, or maybe not, but depending who you ask, but allowing two-way power flows. So if a vehicle is charged in, is plugged in all day, or plugged in, let's say overnight, allowing two-way power flows for that vehicle. I think that was a theory and a concept, maybe tested out a little bit. And then the Ford F-150, I'll name a vehicle OEM, but the Ford F-150 commercial, the Lightning. Even my wife, who's not a truck person at all, said, "Ooh, that's pretty cool, Ted." And I'm like, "Wow, you'd actually let me get a truck if it could power the house, huh?" So that single event, I don't know if it's you at Dominion, Danny, but it is an uptick in customers really asking about that and thinking about, is that real? And the way I look at that is, that there's potential for that down the road, because when you have let's say a vehicle, a pure battery electric vehicle that has a 300-mile range, that's only on average driven 50, 60 miles a day, there's a lot of capacity in there that can be tapped into. Maybe not every day, maybe not every week, but maybe key points during the year. But Danny, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, because I know you're living and breathing that from a utility perspective.
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate, Ted, of the walk before you run. So we think that, I think the V2G is going to be fascinating. It's but it's going to take some time, and I think there are the basic investments that have to be made. But I think this is one of the things that I think it all is, as what I would essentially describe ourselves as planners and complex problem solvers. You do need to be thinking about those things. The example that I would use is that in Virginia, we have a school bus program, and the school bus, it's utilized essentially in the morning and the afternoon, but it's parked a lot of times. And if your utility peaks during the during the summer in the afternoon, and the buses and the batteries available to provide capacity to your system, in theory, that model works. Two-way flow is a little more complicated. Utility planners probably hate it. I know many distribution planners who struggle around that. But I will say those are the kind of things I think we need to be thinking about. It's not I think the initial problem that we're trying to solve. I think you hit on a point that I think is pretty important, is that, look, it is really all the above, at least at this stage in the game. The way I see South Carolina currently developing, you've got a dominant DC fast charge model that's being deployed, quite frankly, very well by, look, I'll say the name, it's Tesla. They're good at what they do. They know where the infrastructure needs to go. They're hugely collaborative with the utilities because they know they have to have the energy to be able to deliver, to be able to keep the uptime on their station. But I also think you're right. The ultimate balancing of the system, it's ultimately going to fail if you're DC fast charging or you're at the next level of charging or at megawatt charging. You're going to have to more reasonably space out the purchases of energy. So there's a like in South Carolina, I see a void in what I would describe as level 2 charging, just marketplace charging. People aren't investing enough now. They need an easy way to deploy capital, either through a partner or through some other model, so that you don't have to. You can deal a lot less with, or have to deal with, the necessity charging a lot less. That makes the system work. I'm curious, Jonathan, about what in Pennsylvania, in your jurisdiction, are you seeing? How much DC fast charging deployment are you seeing along your major, kind of your major interstate areas?
Yeah, Dan, thanks for that question. It's not something I have an answer to, actually. That is probably something that would be more easily answered either by our PUC or Department of Transportation. I just don't have that level of data currently available.
Gotcha. I guess I'm a little advantaged in that because they have to call me every time, at least in our service territory. And I think we've actually helped develop a fairly healthy partnership. Kind of a question back to you. How important will it be for the ecosystem partners to work together to advance the electrification of transportation? I see there's, again, it's some of it's a little, if you're in the regulated utility business and you want to do something, you're subject to, what the legislation says, and then ultimately what the regulator interprets that legislation to say. And so normally entities who could be really strong partners sometimes end up as on opposite sides of the table in a litigated proceeding. So how important is it for ecosystem partners to work together, and what are some of those types of partnerships that could be positive? And please include not just charging manufacturers, but what are things that maybe people aren't thinking of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, it's extremely important. I mean, even Tesla, which you mentioned, the charging network, they begrudgingly, my interpretation is begrudgingly have the charging network because it drives demand, but they don't want to be a charging network provider. But so doing that, every EV manufacturer, cannot do that on their own. And I think we're seeing much more partnerships develop versus branded, charging infrastructure out there by manufacturer. But I mean, I look at this as I don't know the right analogy, but it's the chicken and egg and something else, two other things. I mean, again, those 4 towers that I mentioned before, you've got to have all of those working in concert for to again grease the skids for a scale electrification play. So due to that, I mean, due to the stakeholders across that, I mean, you've got to have that interaction. So it is the OEMs, it is the charging providers, It is the utilities, offering those programs for charging. It is the dealer service network. It is the government policymakers, all working in tandem. And I'll just give you an example. Danny, you and I both mentioned the salespeople at the dealerships. There's programs in some states like California that actually provides extra incentives and it's a state level program that through their ZEV, I think it's funded through their ZEV program, that actually offers additional incentives to salespeople because they know that sales process is going to be longer with an EV. So it offers an additional per vehicle incentive for every vehicle they sell in order to flip the incentives so that they're not, they're incented to sell more EVs, not just to sell the quickest vehicle they can. That's an example of, of ecosystem partners working together across that. And, it does provide, it requires a lot more training, et cetera there. Another example that we're seeing, we're seeing a lot of, obviously charging providers. I think just over the last month, I've seen 2 different, announcements for charging providers and vehicle manufacturers working, kind of announcing deals, et cetera there. But, I think it's going back to that charge everywhere model. In order to do that, you've got to, the commercial side of this, the for-profit, you're going to have stations pop up in the places that it's commercially viable. But in places where it's not commercially viable, but it's necessary, or in potential disadvantaged communities, et cetera, it's tremendously important to bring multiple players together to determine how do you fill those gaps. And one of the things that we've looked at before is if you look at the air quality maps of I won't say most cities, but a lot of cities, right? The air quality maps, you actually see lower air quality in many of the areas that also have lower income populations. And then you overlay a map where the charging infrastructure is, and you see these charging deserts often in these same areas. So, again, one strategy that's really looked at, adopted by some states, is really to have have utilities then concentrate, at least a portion of their EVSE programs, in those lower income underserved areas. And it's, that's an example from a, low income. You also mentioned kind of like, I think you mentioned the broadband, similarity to the broadband rollout. In order to make sure you get universal access, you've got to focus on those more rural areas as well, just so that you can enable that final link in the chain. But Danny, get back to you. I'm sure you have thoughts on this subject as well.
Yeah. So in South Carolina, at least in the Dominion service territory, between 25 and 30% of our customers live in multifamily housing. And so unless there's a way to provide some level 2 charging to those market participants, they're just not market participants at that point. And I think that's where I don't want to compete, like, for example, with Tesla. I want to give them energy for level 3, and I want to sell them energy, and they know their model, they know the algorithms, they know, the amount of business. I've done contracting with them. They know that part of the business. But the ability to supply, for example, level 2 charging in some of these multifamily or in some of these marketplace solutions is space that's, that there needs to be someone to come fill that void if we're going to collectively create this, this transition. Which brings me to another question. And Jonathan, I'll start with you, and then we'll roll back. But, are there things that there's going to have to be workforce basically and it's at all levels. I think of electricians, those I've had our workplace chargers here at work. I'm not going to name the brand, but they don't always work all the time, and somebody's got to fix them, right? So do we have enough workforce to do all the things that are necessary? And that's from electricians to, in Jonathan, your case, what does happen when someone needs assistance and they have an electric vehicle? I mean, does that mean you're having to provide an additional piece of equipment that's on the road that's going to help that person? How does that work? Have we thought about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. When you're looking at a transportation emergency, so let's say you've got a snow event, the snow event comes through, locks down traffic because there's an accident ahead, snow's piling up, obviously you can't get the plows in there, people start getting stranded. So what happens then? Especially what happens between your traditional combustion engine vehicles and then your electric vehicles? Well, there's a lot of science out there that doesn't necessarily intersect. Just before this, I was looking at several different sources, specifically on the I-95 issue in Virginia with the snow, and there was some debate as to who performed better, electric vehicles or gasoline vehicles, which could last longer in a long duration stoppage of vehicles. But from the planning that we've done, and again, very much in the infancy on the planning here, we're going to treat a dead electric vehicle on the roadway just like it's a normal disabled vehicle. We're going to work to try to get that vehicle out of the lane of traffic, try to get that driver assisted in whatever way we can. For our emergency planning at this point in time, a dead EV and a dead combustion engine are one and the same. It's still something we need to move out of the way to try to get the flow of traffic reestablished, and also try to get the occupants of that vehicle to a point of refuge or to a point of assistance where we can get them whatever it is that they may need. Now, in Pennsylvania being a Commonwealth, that's going to be executed primarily at the local level. So a lot of those types of events don't even percolate up to the state level. But if we were to get a state level event, and again, we've looked at the Virginia issue with 95, we've had our own over the past few years. That is something that we're considering and talking to our ESF1 transportation partners. That would be their initial playbook activity was it's a disabled vehicle, and we'll worry about collecting that vehicle once we get the traffic backlog cleared and the people who are stranded onto the way to safety. So as far as removing that vehicle, one of the things we'd be looking at is you're not going to do a hookback type tow vehicle. You're going to do a flatbed tow to try to make sure you're not towing it on the power generating wheels. So that's something that's going to be considered, but again, that's going to be done more at that local level and really between the owner of the vehicle and then whoever it is that's out there as the authority having jurisdiction and providing them the right type of service.
No, that's very insightful. Ted, what is there any, I mean, I think of all the above in terms of the workforce. As I try to build out my electrification team now, it's I can't hire fast enough or maybe not. I need people with certain skill sets, and I'm not sure they actually exist today, that we've got to train them and get them in the pipeline. So where do you see the deficiencies in, I think, the workforce piece?
Yeah, I have two thoughts here. I mean, there is a certain amount of training and specialization that has to happen, but to your point, when if you're doing if you're doing a charging station, implementation in a fleet depot or something, a lot of that construction, a lot of the pieces of that are not all that different than maybe another type of major electrical expansion. So they're trenching, conduit, electricians, whatever. So there is some specialization that has to happen, but I think it's kind of back to the larger issue we have of skilled tradespeople and being in high demand and workforce challenges there. I think that the EV trained people, in the consulting world where we do a lot of EV work, and right now, I mean, we are for the last 3 years. We've been a great training ground for people to go elsewhere because, it is, if you can put EV in your resume, you are in high demand and you can kind of name your price. And so I do think it's, it's hot, but at the end of the day, I think, I think it's back to addressing kind of just the overall, availability of skilled tradespeople, et cetera.
Yeah, Ted, that's a good point. I've got a 13-year-old, almost 14-year-old at home, and I'm going to put in my dad hat right now. He's starting to think about what careers he has in front of him, and he wanted to get into diesel technology. I said, that's great, but maybe you want to start thinking about electric technology with electric vehicles. So, that's something we're starting to kind of nudge him toward. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to workforce development, you don't see a lot of that, especially at the high school level. You're not seeing a lot, at least locally here in the Harrisburg area. talking about that emerging technology. So hopefully vocational schools and community colleges, trade schools will start picking that up and start helping with building out workforce at that level.
Yeah, that's a great point. Excellent. So this was a question that actually somebody posted, and I just pulled it up, and I'm going to model it a little differently. They were asking specifically about charging for larger assets, specifically in agricultural space. But I'll ask the bigger question, which is, we've talked a lot about passenger charging today in the context of building infrastructure and how we move, vehicles to be electrified. How about megawatt charging? I'm starting to see in South Carolina logistical companies that are they're starting to look, Ted, at the fleets. And we're starting to see logistical companies that do work short haul for ports thinking about, not KW charging, but MW charging. And that's the next iteration. And then should we actually let's don't be so focused on kilowatt charging in level 3 and level 2, but maybe we should be thinking about the next iteration, which could be the most impactful for the grid.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big, it's a, I mean, it's a, big opportunity, but also a big, potential driver of disruption. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, there is, if you look at, I mentioned earlier, kind of the supply and demand, on the grid, all the way across the value chain, there is a lot of excess capacity, in that value chain during, in certain locations and certain times, but in other cases there's not. So I mean, it's a question of, universally it could, there's a lot of challenges there. But if you think about, wrong place, wrong time, wrong scale, it's an issue. But if you start turning some of those wrongs to right. So you think about location. Obviously, there's where new load capacity is and the intersection with that, new load coming into the system, and the capacity upstream is a big concern. Utilities know how to deal with that and planning for that. But it's also the wrong time. I'm not familiar with that port equipment, but they're really thinking about, when you would charge that, the ability to, to have the smart charging capability to throttle that charging or even interrupt that charging would be critical, especially if we've done it at scale there. And so anyway, it's a really good question, and one of those that back to your earlier point, Danny, is like, it's going to be a head scratcher for years.
I'll close with, we got actually a minute, but I'll just give a quick question here, just off the top of your head, a little scenario planning. Worst case force majeure event for EV transportation, and how could you mitigate that risk? That's I'll answer for South Carolina, because we're subject to the tropical storm event. It's that evacuation, and then it's also the restoration process. And if fleets or vehicles that are equipped with electricity are also part of the restoration process, you've got kind of the worst scenario. So I'll ask Jonathan, you probably have thought of the worst case, and then Ted, if in one jurisdiction, what's the worst case?
Yeah, I mean, sure have, Dan. And taking your tropical scenario out of it and replacing it with a winter weather scenario is probably most likely for us. But I think the cascading of events are still going to be the same. So if you get an event that results in a long duration, large area power outage, how does that affect the ability for EVs to get recharged? And then as you start to move EVs out of that space, if they need to recharge again, once they get into a powered area, what does that demand look like as far as the grid is concerned? So those are a couple of things that, myself as an emergency manager would start thinking of, because we're always looking at cascading effects from the primary event. So it would be, really, what has occurred? What is the impact on the grid, both pro and con? And then how do we make sure that we get people from the affected area to an area where they can be safe and secure, and then feel like they're secure because, you know, in this case, an operator of an EV will have reliable access to power. And a lot of that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the policy discussions of how do we build out that infrastructure to give the customers that level of comfort that they may want.
Excellent. All right, Ted, I'm going to give you the last word. What's the worst case?
You know, I will start. I am not an energy management expert, so or an emergency management expert. So I am not going to answer that question directly. I'm going to answer it indirectly and say this. You know, if you look at the transportation sector, roughly a third of the energy, is used in the transportation sector, and then roughly a third of our carbon emissions comes from the transportation sector. So I think, talking about the impact of electrifying the transportation sector is tremendous, and the impact on, climate change, et cetera, is tremendous. That might, stave off worsening of some of these force majeure events. So I think the biggest risk we have is not solving some of these, this ecosystem-wide problems we have, and, maybe proving the naysayers right. And missing this, missing an opportunity for the transportation sector to electrify, to move quickly into electrification. So I mean, I think it's the missed opportunity is one of the biggest challenges we have there as well.
Yeah, well stated. Well stated. So I think we're at the end of our time slot, but I wanted to thank Ted and Jonathan for their perspectives, and it was a lot of fun talking about, I think the what if. It's an exciting time in the energy business. It's never been this exciting in my 35-year career. So I'm looking forward to kind of this next juncture. So again, thank everybody, and we appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you today.
My pleasure, Dan.
Danny, Ted, Jonathan, thank you so much.